For some women, being good is just too boring. A teenager tries to ease her pain with violence.
It had the worst possible ending.
A new bride gives her husband anything but love.
It was all a facade.
And when a troubled soul gets a break, she blows it all away.
I don't think she could imagine her life without him.
In 2013, in Coates, North Carolina. Miranda Dean is only 18, and she likes breaking all the rules. Her wild ways attract 21-year-old local, Elliot Barber.
Do you want something stronger?
Well, yeah. I'm always up for something stronger.
Miranda meets Elliot, who's working a blue-collar job, and he's just kind of bouncing through life, and immediately they fall in love.
Smitten, he doesn't even mind that she's a single mom.
Isn't she gorgeous?
Yeah.
Miranda really enjoyed taking care of her baby daughter.
She was a good mother, was very protective of her child.
Okay, I think it's time for a nap. Let's go.
But there's something about Miranda.
So, this is what I was telling you about.
Her job, for example.
Are you a prostitute?
No, I'm just a companion.
Miranda hires herself out to men who are willing to pay for a chat.
Do you make a lot of money?
Yeah, enough to make it worth it.
Strangely, she charges between $50 and $850, but no sex involved.
One dirty time.
I have to put something.
What man is gonna pay her $850 to talk all night?
I don't know, that's what they really like.
Miranda met strange men for chit-chat.
Most men would object, but not Elliot. The lure of cash overrules his jealousy.
You know, I had a really great time talking to you.
Yeah, me too.
You know, it was a real pleasure to meet you.
You know, so Elliot looks at it as, hey, she's not having sex with these guys. She's getting paid all this money to listen to them talk about their lifeless marriages.
Elliot has some doubts, though.
Easy pickings.
You're still my girl, though.
Yeah, of course I am.
He doesn't want to lose Miranda to a client.
Marry me.
What?
Marry me.
Really? Yes. Yes.
After a couple months of being together, they decided to pick up and go get married.
But the new bride has another secret.
Miranda was a victim of ongoing sexual abuse at a very young age.
Her abuser, he's sentenced to 19 years in prison for this sexual abuse. So we gotta wonder, just how severe was it? It's probably the most graphic, most vile type of sexual abuse you can ever imagine.
It's okay. You okay?
The psychological trauma and long-lasting effects that child sex abuse victims go through is profound. It was a marriage made in hell.
Miranda's psychological trauma finds one place for comfort. But it's a strange choice.
Miranda had visions and fantasies of things that did not exist. She was part of the satanic cult.
Deliver us, Almighty Satan, from all my past errors and delusions, and fill me with truth, wisdom, and understanding.
Now she wants to draw her husband into her faith.
Hail Satan.
That tells me Miranda is a sociopath. Psychopaths are born, sociopaths are made.
Hail Satan.
In Miranda's case, it had the worst possible ending.
Miranda wants to move to a new town, out of the prying eyes of friends and family.
Come on.
Why do we have to go?
For thrills, adventure, excitement.
3 days after they were married, they packed the car up and they moved to Pennsylvania.
Besides, it's your birthday soon, and I have planned the ultimate thrill.
Okay.
Miranda has other plans. There's something else going on here. She's a nice girl, and I'll pay her a little bit of money. What harm could come to me?
"18-year-old Miranda Barber has found a willing participant in her satanic practices.
Our master must bless us.
Her new husband, Elliot.
Elliot Barber loved his wife, and his wife was able to manipulate and con him into doing whatever she wanted to do.
He's happy to follow her.
Hail Satan.
Miranda and Elliot brought out the worst in each other.
On November 11th, 2013, Miranda meets her last client.
Hey, wanna go in my car?
No, I'm coming in my car. I want to take you for a drive.
Okay. He wanted her to get into his vehicle. She talked him out of it. He had gotten into her vehicle.
The plan is she'll drive 6, 8, 10 miles.
Miranda wants Troy to feel at ease
I'm really glad we're doing this.
Been looking forward to seeing you.
because she has a surprise.
Yeah, me too.
It's a trap, and husband Elliot is here to help.
They had made a deal. They were going to find someone and kill someone, and it didn't matter who.
It's my belief she's killing her abuser. She's just trying to answer the demons in her head and look for an excuse here.
Miranda was full of rage against men. It only takes one well-placed stab wound to kill someone, maybe two. But she stabbed him 20 times. She was having fun with it.
Is he dead?
Troy suffered. He wasn't dead.
Let's get him out of here. Let's get him out of here.
He was dying. And they just threw him on the side of the road like a piece of garbage.
So they rifle through his wallet and they find $150.
Just take the whole thing.
And And what do? Let's go to a strip club.
Miranda had just committed a premeditated, vicious murder. And she was so excited, she wanted to go out and celebrate.
After all, it's her husband's birthday.
Thank you so much. Keep the change.
Cheers.
The next day, Troy's body is found. And one thing is clear. It's a homicide.
Miranda Barber's anger really is displayed in this murder because Troy is stabbed in the head, the face, the neck, the chest. Everywhere, there was rage here. Rage and hate.
It's a brutal crime. But the police get an early lead.
There was a cell phone. Miranda and Mr. LaFerrare were text messaging back and forth.
While planning the attack, Miranda thought of everything, except the obvious.
The cell phone records prove his last phone call was to Miranda. Now she can't deny it.
So, Miranda.
Miranda Barber tries to be intimidating.
You ready to start again?
Yeah, sure.
She wants to appear bigger than what she is.
Journalist Francis Scarcella interviews Miranda behind bars. And he's served quite a shock.
I want to talk to you about Troy's murder.
This wasn't the first time.
What do you mean? How many people have you killed?
I don't know, less than 100?
You're 18 years old, and you're telling me you've killed less than 100 people.
And I said, you have to give me a number. And she had said...
Well, I stopped counting at 22.
She stopped counting at 22.
It's a shocking claim. But few believe it.
Miranda's story of killing 21, 22 people was false. But that tells me that's what she wanted to do. And she thought about it a lot.
In 2014, both Miranda and Elliot Barber plead guilty to second-degree murder. They are sentenced to life in prison with no parole.
Miranda Barber had a horrific life, but at the end of the day, she's a liar and she's a manipulator, and I believe at this point that the world is safer with Miranda Barber behind bars.
Miranda chose to ease her pain by inflicting it on others.
Miranda received a life sentence without parole. I hope that stands. She's a very, very troubled, damaged, and dangerous person. She never had it so good. Could buy anything she wanted. But what she wanted most was to hit him.
It's David is not breathing.
Vegas, where futures are won and lost, on roulette tables and in wedding chapels.
Dearly beloved, we are gathered here today to join this man and this woman in holy matrimony.
June 28, 2015. English couple, 51-year-old David and 42-year-old Sharon Edwards, have high hopes for a new beginning.
This ring, I thee wed.
It seemed to be a bit of a whirlwind romance. They were married within a year of starting dating.
You show me what true love is.
I think it's fair to say that their relationship was very intense and passionate at the outset.
Turned David's head, she stepped way out of her league. David had everything she wanted and a big bank account. She never had it so good. For the first time in her life, she had a beautiful home, was going on holidays, could buy anything she wanted.
It's great.
She always looked dolled up.
Oh, I love it.
Early in the relationship, Sharon starts laying down the law.
Darling.
Sharon, what a surprise.
Sharon would constantly mither David at work.
I thought we could go for lunch today.
Oh, I'm sorry, love. I'm quite busy.
And she just basically made a nuisance of herself.
Sharon is isolating David from his colleagues and friends.
Look at that guy, he's a master. Would you look at that?
David was a big football fan, spent a lot of time watching the football games and enjoyed the social aspects.
Hey, Lily. There's something I got today.
Hey, we're watching the football. Oh, we missed the goal. Oh, come on, Sharon, it's my team.
Sharon was always the dominant person in the relationship.
I think you better leave. Get all the way to organise. It's not a single man anymore.
Okay.
Sharon was a very high-maintenance individual, very needy, quite a jealous person.
The relationship became volatile fairly quickly.
It's nothing personal, as Sharon's previous boyfriends know well.
Sharon was the kind of person who wanted to wield control over her partners.
Hi, love. I'm back. You're late.
Love?
Sharon had a need to abuse men.
What you doing? That'll teach you to be late.
Sharon had some previous allegations against her of domestic abuse and some previous convictions for violence. One such allegation related to her allegedly punching and biting a previous partner.
Sharon had a long history of physically abusing husbands before she met David. Leopards don't change their spots.
Sharon has the hallmarks of a sadist.
What she wanted most was to hit him.
David joins a secret club of victims, abused men.
David never called the police. Male abuse victims rarely do.
He was coming to work with facial injuries. He did try to cover that up, but let's not forget he was working with professional individuals who dealt with this sort of thing on a day-to-day basis.
You okay, David?
Yes, I'm fine.
I don't believe you.
So they were quite astute to work out that actually these were the hallmarks of violence abuse.
But soon, David has other problems. A restructuring of his law firm leaves him out in the cold.
David, it's been a very hard decision.
He's made redundant.
I think the underlying aspects of that is that they were aware that David's been in an abusive relationship and his life becoming a little bit chaotic.
I'm very sorry, David.
Sharon didn't like it. As she saw it, David's employer was doing to David what she was supposed to do.
In 2015, in Chorley, England, lawyer David Edwards has some bad news for fiancée Sharon.
What are you doing home?
It's over. I've been made redundant.
When David's professional status was diminished,
I lost my job.
Sharon was personally insulted and upset.
But Sharon has planned their wedding and a holiday in Spain.
Sharon, I said don't call him. I don't want you to...
She doesn't want to lose either.
You're crazy.
You pathetic moron.
Hang up the phone.
Do you know what you've done to us? I'm gonna find you.
And what did the future hold? If he was no longer a solicitor, would she still be able to enjoy holidays, spending money and such?
Despite the violence, David clings to Sharon, and they go through with their Vegas wedding in June 2015.
With this ring, I thee wed.
You may kiss the bride.
On the surface, everything looked like the perfect romantic elopement, but it was all a facade. He had to use concealer on an eye injury on the day of the wedding. This is what David's life had become, just constantly being injured, belittled.
2 months later, the jet-setting couple head to Spain, despite David having no income.
Hello.
They'd had a disaster with the hotel and they'd had to change venues.
I got you something.
One of the flights was cancelled and the situation was very fraught by the time they arrived home.
Thanks, Woman David.
Do you like him?
Yeah. How was it? It was hopeless. No wonder he got sacked.
Don't start.
Don't you tell me not to start. Lazy, lazy sod.
Sharon's daughter from a previous marriage notices the tension.
Sharon was ridiculing David about the fact that he was losing his job as a solicitor.
I'm sick of this.
She described him as being struck off.
David! David!
It was designed to make him look foolish.
Why'd you do it?
The stab wound to his chest was about 8 centimetres in depth, straight into his heart.
Sharon wounds her husband.
Sorry.
But she doesn't call the ambulance.
I love you.
She just put
that they love. David died from massive internal bleeding.
Only then Sharon runs for help.
Her reaction has been described by some as a fake hysteria. She ran out of the house screaming and crying.
David is not breathing. What? He's not breathing.
She said that the stabbing had been accidental, that David walked onto the blade.
We need an ambulance. Now.
Like all good psychopaths or sociopaths, she was trying to get out of the responsibility for what she had done.
When authorities examine David's body, they uncover a history of sadistic abuse.
Over 60 external injuries, the stab wounds, healed wounds, prod marks, pokes, puncture marks. David had sustained quite a lot of injuries.
The judge said he didn't think Sharon intended to kill David, and I don't think she did either. Why would she kill her toy? For a sadist, once their partner or victim is dead, the party's over.
In March 2016, Sharon Edwards is convicted of murder and sentenced to a minimum of 20 years in prison.
David's case goes to show how many of us don't know what's going on behind closed doors.
We may never know the full motivation for David not wanting to make complaints against Sharon. There might have been some element of fear. If he did make an issue of it, then would he be a victim of further abuse?
Domestic violence against men just seems to be such a taboo subject, and something needs to change.
Can I get you gentlemen anything?
When a woman gets a second chance
He saw a pretty woman in distress.
at life and love,
He didn't care about her past.
don't get in the way.
She is a cold-blooded woman.
Get on your knees if you want to pray.
1933, Shreveport, Louisiana. 17-year-old Tony Joe Henry is a town favorite.
Here's your favorite girl.
Tony Jo was beautiful. She had a fabulous figure.
I swear you get more beautiful every day.
And men looked at her with desire.
Flattery gave you everything.
Lacking in education, but blessed with a natural charm, Tony Joe uses her looks to make a living.
Tony Joe had no marketable skills.
Ton, you two got a room.
The skill she developed was being a prostitute in a whorehouse.
Tony Joe knows how to please men.
She moved with sort of a casual arrogance.
And how to manipulate them.
There's a certain amount of power that she could exert as a beautiful woman and as a prostitute over men.
You're killing me, kid.
What a way to go. You forget something?
Tony Joe had never used drugs when she entered the house, but the men that she had as customers often gave her drugs to tip her.
Heroin helps Tony Joe forget the present and the past.
Tony Joe had a rough start in her life. Her mom died of tuberculosis when she was only 6 years old. And her father remarried a woman who was very cold.
Her stepmom would never win Mother of the Year.
Cash first?
Tony Joe's stepmother would go to bars and sell herself to men to augment their earnings.
Who's the kid?
And Tony Joe was made to go into the bar with her stepmother.
She uses 12-year-old Tony Joe as bait.
Lazy little thing.
Tony Joe's evil stepmother introduced her to alcohol and prostitution.
Now.
Children that are abused, such as Tony Joe,
This is John.
develop survival skills to stay alive, and that's what she did.
But Tony has no intention of staying a hooker. By age 20, she turns a new leaf.
Tony Joe went to Austin, Texas to begin a new life. She found work as a waitress.
Can I get you gentlemen anything?
Well, ma'am, anything you bring me will be fine by me.
In the fall of 1939, the bad girl meets a bad boy, Claude Cowboy Henry.
He was a down-on-his-luck former boxer. He had a history of petty crimes.
What y'all doing later?
If you're lucky, you might be walking me home.
For Tony Joe and Claude Henry, it was all her.
Tony Joe, I brought you here to get you off the drugs.
What? I'm out of here.
He made her go cold turkey.
Get off of me! Get off of me! Get off of me!
There weren't going to be any niceties about kicking her heroin habit.
Cowboy was a pretty devoted guy. He helped her get off heroin. He didn't care about her past. He loved her.
Clean, sober, and in love, Tony Joe marries her man. Life is finally looking up.
She thought they would have a home, children, a normal life. It was not to be.
Hey, you still working? Come on. One for old time's sake.
1939, Beaumont, Texas. 24-year-old Tony Joe Henry's past catches up with her.
They were at a restaurant, and that's when the former customer saw Tony Joe.
You still working?
I'm married.
He asked Tony Joe if she was still working at Madame Sylvie's.
Come on. One for old time's sake.
At this point, Cowboy comes out of the restroom and sees what's going on. Does not take kindly to it at all.
Cowboy beat him to death.
Arrested for murder, Cowboy has his day in court.
Claude Henry.
Cowboy thought it was a good idea to represent himself in a capital murder case.
You have been found guilty of murder.
Turned out it wasn't a good idea.
The court sentences you to 50 years behind bars.
No! I'll get you out now!
I don't think she could imagine her life without him.
Save you! I'll save you!
When the gavel came down and the judge said 50 years, Tony Joe's life ended. And she wasn't about to let that happen.
Tony Joe springs into action. She hooks up with Cowboy's friend, 23-year-old Archie Burks, and plots her next move.
And if we strike here,
The main idea that Tony Joe comes up with, she wants to rob a bank.
we can get over the border so fast.
She thought if they had money to get a new lawyer, he could represent Cowboy and get a new trial.
They'll never find us.
Sounds like a good plan.
If you're gonna rob a bank, it's best if you have a getaway car, and that was the next thing they needed.
We need a car. And you will be the bait.
Well, that's easy. I can reel in any man.
I bet you can.
February 14th, 1940. Tony Joe and Archie set their trap.
Quick, someone's coming.
It's a rainy night. She stands outside, obviously in need of a ride. Archie conceals himself when 42-year-old automobile salesman Joseph Calloway sees her in his headlights.
This is a cold, lonely stretch of road. He felt sorry for her, and he wanted to give her a ride.
Hey, you're giving my sister a ride. You're giving me one too, buddy.
Joseph stopped to pick her up because he saw a pretty woman in distress.
He is now riding with the devil.
Do exactly what we say.
Okay, man, I'll do anything. Just please don't shoot. Don't shoot.
They drove a good distance.
Pull in here, now.
Okay, I'll pull it.
They came to a farm and stopped.
Get out of the car, now.
Please don't do anything crazy. I don't have much, but please.
Take off your clothes.
What?
Take them off!
She thought that would make a nice, welcoming out-of-prison outfit for Cowboy.
All she needs is a getaway car.
I won't do nothing. I won't tell no one.
What she takes is revenge.
Get on your knees if you want to pray.
Oh, no, please don't do this.
Having that gun in her hand and having a man on his knees in front of her was the most power she'd ever had.
You don't want to do this. I'm a good person. Please don't hurt me. No.
Shut up.
A shot rang out. One shot right in the center of the forehead. And Calloway was dead.
What did you do? What did you do?
Get in the car.
Her whole life was leading toward that moment. Everything was bad, and it culminated in the death of an innocent person.
Tony Joe thinks she knows how to get away with murder.
Tony Joe, what brings you here?
Tony Joe arrived at her aunt's house
I'm in trouble.
She told her aunt that she shot a man. She was crying and upset.
She is sure her family can help.
I'm scared. I'm scared about what's going to happen to me.
Her Aunt Emma was a twin, and her twin brother happened to be a captain in the state police.
It's a serious crime.
And he might be able to get Tony Joe off, she thought.
She's wrong. Her uncle is an incorruptible lawman who puts justice before family. In 1940, Tony Joe Henry and Archie Burks are found guilty of murder and sentenced to death.
This is a tragic comedy. She ends up on death row. Cowboy still is in prison. Nothing worked out the way that they thought it was going to go.
From an early age, Tony Joe is taught to survive on her looks, a lesson she takes to her grave.
She loved the way she looked. She loved her beautiful hair. Her hair had always been her glory.
Tony Joe was cool, calm, and collected about being executed until the barber shaved her head.
She said, "Now remember, I'm sentenced to execution, not mutilation."
To the day she dies, Tony Joe has many friends.
The priest came to the jail cell and placed a small box on her lap. Inside the box was a beautiful scarf. The priest helped her tie it around her head so that her head would not be bare as she walked to the electric chair.
Tony Joe was close to happiness. Free and clear of drugs, with a man who loved her, until her past walked into the bar.
Love does not conquer all. And in this case in particular, it just led to death. Both Tony Joe and Cowboy had this romanticized outlaw mentality where they thought they would be able to get away with these things, and none of it was true.
These deadly women had darkness within. Miranda Barber made violence her savior. Sharon Edwards.
The phone rang just after dawn, the kind of ring that cuts through sleep like a blade. And for a split second, no one wanted to answer it because everyone knew that phones only rang like that when something terrible had already happened, when the night had finished its work and the morning arrived to collect the debt. And in a quiet California suburb where lawns were trimmed and doors were rarely locked, that sound would echo for decades, because this was a call that marked the moment a teenager vanished without a trace. The moment a normal weekday cracked open into a cold case that refused to die. She was 17, late for school, her backpack still leaning against the bedroom wall, her bed made with the careless precision of someone who expected to return by afternoon. And when her mother stepped outside to look for her, the air felt wrong. Too still, like the neighborhood itself was holding its breath. Down the street, sprinklers ticked on and off, newspapers lay untouched on driveways, and somewhere between the curb and the corner, the last ordinary footprint of a missing teen dissolved into nothing. By noon, the word missing had hardened into something heavier, something officials carried carefully as they spoke to cameras, assuring the community that this was likely a misunderstanding, a runaway scenario, a teenage argument blown out of proportion. But the family knew better because there was no note, no packed bag, no history of disappearing acts, just silence and a growing sense that something irreversible had already occurred. Police knocked on doors, asked the same questions over and over. Anyone hear a scream, see a strange car, notice anything out of place? And the answers came back empty, a chorus of shrugs and apologies, while helicopters began to hum overhead, tracing slow circles like vultures pretending not to circle. The first search swept the nearby fields, the dry creek bed, the stretch of highway that cut the town in half like a scar, and volunteers moved shoulder to shoulder, eyes on the ground, hoping to find anything that would make sense of the absence. A shoe, a scrap of fabric, a dropped notebook. But the ground gave nothing back. And by the third day, the phrases started to change. Concern turning into fear. Fear turning into the unspoken understanding that this was no longer just a missing teen, but the opening chapter of something darker. Candlelight vigils flickered at the school gates. Classmates whispering rumors that grew more elaborate by the hour. Some swearing they'd seen her get into a car. Others insisting she'd been arguing with someone older, someone dangerous. And every version collided in the same place. A wall of uncertainty that refused to crack. Detectives arrived from the county, then the state, spreading case files across folding tables, pinning photos and maps to temporary boards, drawing lines that connected places and times that might not matter at all. Because in the early days of a cold case in the making, every detail feels like the key, every lead feels urgent, and every hour that passes feels like betrayal. They traced their last confirmed steps in the front door to corner the street, found a neighbor who thought they'd heard a car door slam, another who remembered a vehicle idling longer than usual, a third who noticed nothing at all. And with each interview, the timeline blurred instead of sharpening, the truth slipping further away the harder it was chased. Then came the first shock, the kind that rattles a community awake at night, when police confirmed that the teen's personal belongings had been found miles away, discarded near an industrial area far from any route she would normally take. And suddenly the idea of a voluntary disappearance collapsed under its own weight. This wasn't a runaway story anymore, this was a crime, and the words foul play began appearing in headlines, right next to her school photo, frozen in a smile that now felt accusatory, as if asking why no one had been watching closely enough. The investigation surged forward with new urgency, tip lines lighting up, psychics calling in with visions, self-proclaimed witnesses offering memories that grew more dramatic with every retelling, and detectives learned quickly how loud chaos could be, how it could drown out the quiet truth hiding underneath. A suspect emerged, then faded. A man questioned and released, his alibi thin but unbreakable, and another name followed, and another, each one sparking brief hope before collapsing into the same dead end, until the case file grew thick with paper and thin on answers. Weeks turned into months, months into years, and the case began to cool in a way only cold cases do, not suddenly, but gradually, like a fire start of oxygen. The media moving on, resources redirected, the town learning how to live with a ghost in its midst. The family refused to let go, organizing searches long after officials stopped asking, taping flyers to poles already layered with sun-bleached paper, standing on street corners with photos that grew older as they did, while detectives rotated out, handing the file to new eyes who promised fresh perspectives and delivered the same questions. Every anniversary reopened the wound. Every rumor reignited hope just long enough to hurt again, and the phrase California missing teen cold case settled into the community's vocabulary like an old bruise, tender and unavoidable. People whispered about it at diners and football games, speculated about secrets the town might be hiding, wonder how something so violent could happen in a place that still looked so calm, and the unanswered question hovered over everything, not just what happened to her, but who among them might know more than they were saying. Years later, technology would change, DNA databases would expand, forensic methods would sharpen, and detectives would revisit old evidence with new tools, reopening boxes sealed with dust and disappointment, hoping that time itself had left something behind, a trace overlooked, a pattern missed. But in these early days, in the raw aftermath of her disappearance, there was only the relentless uncertainty, the sense that the truth was close enough to feel but too slippery to hold. The case hadn't officially been called cold yet, but the chill was already there, creeping into conversations, into police reports, into the way the family spoke about the future, as if it were something fragile and conditional. And somewhere between the flashing lights of the initial search and the quiet resignation that followed, the community realized the story wasn't going to end quickly, that the disappearance of one teenager had opened a wound time couldn't easily close. And as the headlines faded and the cameras packed up, the mystery settled in, patient and heavy, waiting, while a family learned how to live with unanswered questions, and a town learned how to look at familiar streets and wonder what they were really hiding. Because the most unsettling cold cases don't announce themselves as unsolved at the beginning, they whisper it Softly, as the years began to pile up, the town tried to move on, but the case wouldn't let it. Because every quiet afternoon carried the echo of unanswered questions, and every passing car slowed just a little too much at the corner where she was last seen, as if the pavement itself remembered. Detectives kept working behind the scenes, though the urgency had dulled, the flashing lights replaced by paperwork and long interviews conducted in rooms that smelled of stale coffee and old files. They reconstructed her life frame by frame, friends first, then acquaintances, then people whose names barely registered in her world, teachers, bus drivers, the clerk at the convenience store she stopped at some mornings, anyone who might have noticed something different, a look, a conversation, a moment that now carried weight it never should have had. They learned about the arguments that hadn't seemed important at the time, the small rebellions of a teenager testing the edges of independence. Nothing dramatic, nothing that screamed danger, but in a cold case in the making, even the ordinary becomes suspicious. A friend mentioned a car that sometimes followed them after school. Another recalled a man who lingered too long near the campus gates. And suddenly sketches were drawn. Descriptions circulated, composite faces pinned to bulletin boards and printed in newspapers, each one a possible answer, each one ultimately dissolving into disappointment. Tips poured in from across the state, even beyond it, some heartfelt, some unhinged, some clearly driven by the thrill of inserting oneself into tragedy, and detectives learned to listen carefully while trusting almost nothing. The industrial area where her belongings were found became a focal point, a place of harsh concrete and chain-link fences, far removed from the safe image of the suburb she vanished from. And investigators walked again and again, tracing possible routes, theorizing about vehicles, timing how long it would take to drive there without being noticed. Security cameras were checked, but this was before everything was watched, before digital eyes covered every corner, and what footage existed was grainy and unhelpful, shadows passing like ghosts, impossible to identify, impossible to rule out. For a moment, there was hope when a witness claimed to have seen a teenage girl matching her description near the area days after she disappeared, but a lead unraveled under scrutiny, the memory too vague, the timeline too shaky, another door slamming shut. As months stretched on, pressure mounted quietly, not just on investigators, but on the family, whose lives had become a cycle of waiting rooms and phone calls that never brought the right news. They were asked the hardest questions about family dynamics, about discipline, about secrets that might have driven her away, and each question felt like an accusation wrapped in procedure. The mother replayed the last conversation over and over, searching for hidden meaning. The father walked the neighborhood at night, staring at houses he'd waved for years, wondering behind any one of those doors sat a truth he couldn't see. Then came another jolt, another headline that sent shockwaves through community, when remains were discovered in a remote area several counties away, and for days the town held its breath, bracing for confirmation, imagining closure even if it came in the most devastating form. Detectives traveled, comparisons were made, forensic tests run, and when the remains were ruled out, relief mixed with despair, because the door that had briefly opened to answers slammed shut again, leaving only the familiar ache of not knowing. It was around this time that the phrase cold case began appearing more frequently, not yet official, but implied, a quiet admission that the trail was cooling faster than anyone wanted to admit. Internal reviews were conducted, timelines re-examined, mistakes acknowledged privately if not publicly, and investigators debated whether something crucial had been missed in those first frantic days. A neighbor's statement was reconsidered, a time estimate adjusted, a suspect re-interviewed. But the results were the same, a looping pattern of effort and frustration that defined so many unsolved cases. The original lead detective retired, the file handed off again, and with each transition, something intangible was lost, a gut feeling, a memory of tone or hesitation that never made it into the report. Meanwhile, rumors hardened into local mythology. Some believed she'd been targeted by a predator passing through. Others insisted it had to be someone local, someone who blended in too well. And a lack of answers gave every theory just enough oxygen to survive. Trust thinned. Parents tightened curfews. The town's image shifted subtly. Safety now something people talked about instead assumed. And her name became a warning whispered to younger kids, a reminder that bad things could happen even here. Investigators chased a promising angle involving a similar disappearance in another state. The details eerily aligned, but coordination across jurisdictions was slow, evidence inconclusive, and eventually the cases drifted apart, connected only by speculation and shared frustration. New forensic techniques were discussed, but the evidence on hand was limited, contaminated by time and handling, and without a body, without a clear crime scene, the case floated in a gray space where certainty was always just out of reach. Years passed. The family aged. The school replaced the lockers she'd used, repainted the halls, welcomed new students who'd never heard her name except in passing, as the story teachers avoided telling directly. Anniversaries came and went with dwindling media attention, a brief spike of interest followed by silence, and each time the story resurfaced, it reopened wounds that never truly healed. The cold case wasn't just unsolved, it was unfinished, a sentence without a period, hanging over everyone connected to it. And yet, beneath the surface, the case never truly slept. Evidence boxes remained on shelves, waiting. Notes sat in margins, questions unanswered. Somewhere in those pages, investigators believed, was a thread that could still be pulled, a connection that might one day tighten into clarity. But for now, the mystery endured, heavy and unresolved, stretching forward in time, as the town learned to live with the absence, and the family learned that hope, even when it hurts, is sometimes the only thing that keeps a cold case from freezing solid. Time did what it always does to unsolved crimes. It buried them under newer tragedies, louder headlines, fresher blood, but it never erased them. It only pressed them deeper into collective memory, where they hardened into something permanent. By the time the case officially carried the label cold case, the words felt less like a classification and more like a verdict, stamped quietly on a file that had already exhausted its chances. The original evidence was reboxed, retagged, and stored, the kind of careful preservation that suggests faith in the future even when the present has failed. And somewhere between those cardboard walls, the story waited, patient and unblinking. A new generation of detectives inherited the case, men and women who hadn't been there for frantic first hours, who didn't remember the helicopters or the vigils, who knew her only through photographs and transcripts, and they approached it with a mix of detachment and reverence, aware that cold cases demand humility. They reread statements with fresh eyes, listening for what wasn't said, for pauses that hinted at fear or lies, and they noticed patterns that hadn't stood out before, small inconsistencies dismissed in the chaos of the early days. A neighbor's timeline didn't quite align. A witness had changed a detail, without realizing it. A car described as blue in one interview had become green in another, and suddenly, the past felt less settled than it once had. The family was contacted again, years after they'd stopped expecting calls, and the conversation reopened wounds they'd learned to live around. Old belongings were requested for DNA comparison, items imbued with memory now repurposed as evidence, and the act of handing them over felt like surrendering pieces of the person they'd lost. They complied anyway, because cold cases survive on cooperation, on the willingness to hope again, even when hope has already betrayed you. The mother's voice trembled as she answered questions she'd answered 100 times before. The father stared at the table, tracing scratches in the wood as if they might spell out the truth. The investigators expanded outward beyond the town, beyond the county, looking for connections that might have been invisible before, and they found a cluster of similar disappearances stretching across years and state lines, none identical, but close enough to raise questions. Teenage girls, transitional spaces, highways, industrial zones, the kind of places where people pass through but rarely linger, and the theory emerged slowly, cautiously, that her disappearance might not have been an isolated event but part of something larger, a pattern hiding in plain sight. The idea was both terrifying and clarifying, because patterns mean predictability, and predictability means someone, somewhere, might still be out there. They tracked old suspects whose names had faded from memory, men who had lived transient lives, who had moved frequently, who had died or disappeared themselves, and they followed paper trails through arrests and employment records, reconstructing movements long after people involved had stopped thinking about them. Some leads ended with gravestones, others with locked doors and refusals, and a few with interviews that crackled with tension, Voices strained as the past resurfaced uninvited. Polygraphs were offered and declined. Alibis were restated with rehearsed precision. Nothing solidified, but the pressure was back, subtle but real, and in the world of cold cases, pressure can be enough to make cracks appear. The community felt the shift, too, the case stirring again like something that had been asleep, but never dead. Old rumors resurfaced. New ones formed. Social media breathed life into theories that once lived only in whispered conversations, and armchair investigators dissected every detail, turning tragedy into content, certainty into speculation. Some accused the wrong people. Others insisted the truth had been known all along and deliberately buried. And through it all, the family watched from a distance, torn between gratitude that the case hadn't been forgotten and exhaustion at seeing it distorted. A breakthrough seemed to come unexpectedly, through a routine evidence audit, when a piece of material long considered unusable was flagged for retesting using updated forensic methods. It wasn't dramatic. No dramatic music cue. Just a lab technician noticing a possibility where others had seen a dead end, and that possibility set off a chain reaction, quiet but relentless. Samples were sent. Comparisons were run. Databases were searched. Weeks passed in silence, the kind that stretches nerves thin, and when results came back, they didn't deliver answers, only another question, another partial match that pointed toward a family line, not a person. Genealogy entered the investigation like a ghost, connecting the present to the past in ways that felt invasive and inevitable. Family trees were built from fragments of data, names pulled from public records, lines drawn between people who'd never imagined they were part of a criminal investigation, and slowly, cautiously, a profile emerged, not of what happened, but of who might have been capable of making it happen. The suspect was no longer a shadow, but a shape, incomplete but unsettlingly real, someone who had lived an unremarkable life on the surface, someone who might have crossed paths with a teen without either of them understanding the significance of that moment. Still, there was no arrest, no press conference, no cathartic reveal. The evidence, while promising, wasn't enough, not yet, and cold cases demand a higher standard because time erodes certainty, memories decay, and juries demand clarity that the past rarely provides. Investigators debated their next move, weighing the risk of pushing too soon against the danger of waiting too long, because every cold case walks a narrow line between patience and paralysis. As the years stacked up, the story took on a strange duality, both frozen and evolving, trapped in a moment of her disappearance, yet constantly reshaped by new interpretations, new technologies, new eyes. The family lived in that tension daily, caught between grief and anticipation, knowing that answers, if they came at all, would arrive late, changed by time, incapable of restoring what was lost. The town carried the weight more quietly now, but it was still there, in the way people glanced at strangers, in the way parents hugged their kid a little longer, in the way certain streets never felt entirely ordinary again. The cold case remained open, unresolved but alive, a reminder that the past is never really past, that unanswered questions have a way of lingering, and as investigators in dimly lit offices stared at photos taken decades earlier, they felt the same pull the community had felt from the beginning. The sense that somewhere, buried beneath layers of time and silence, the truth was waiting, and that when it finally surfaced, it would change everything, even if it came too late to save the one person who mattered most. The case drifted into a strange middle age, no longer fresh enough to dominate headlines, not old enough to be forgotten, existing in that uncomfortable space where hope survives on life support. Detectives rotated again, another handoff, another promise made quietly in a briefing room that this time, something would be different. The file was heavier now, swollen with years of speculation, dead ends, and partial truths, and every page carried the residue of decisions made under pressure, choices that could never be undone. Cold cases don't age gracefully. They accumulate scars, and this one had plenty. A single detail began to gnaw at the investigators, something overlooked because it had seemed too small at the time, a witness statement about a vehicle parked near the street that morning, not suspicious enough to chase, not clear enough to remember accurately. The description had shifted over the years, molded by memory and rumor, but when laid side by side, the inconsistencies formed a shape, a pattern of uncertainty that suggested the truth might be hiding in the gaps. They pulled traffic records, registration databases, anything that could anchor that fleeting image to reality, and the list of possible matches ballooned, then narrowed, then stalled, as so many lists had before. The family watched these developments from the sidelines, cautious, practiced in managing expectations, because every past surge of activity had ended the same way, with apologies and silence. Still, something felt different, not louder, not faster, but more deliberate, and that subtle shift was enough to reopen the emotional calculus they'd spent years trying to balance. They agreed to another round of interviews, another excavation of memory, another retelling of the morning that never seemed to end, and each answer carried the weight of knowing it might be the one detail that finally mattered. The investigators turned inward, questioning not just what they knew, but how they knew it, scrutinizing early assumptions that had shaped the entire trajectory of the case. The runaway theory, briefly entertained and then discarded, had cost time. The focus on certain suspects had narrowed the field too quickly. The industrial area, once treated as a disposal site, might have been something else entirely, a misdirection, intentional or accidental. Cold cases teach humility the hard way, and this one forces handlers to admit that certainty had been an illusion from the start. Another lead surfaced, fragile but intriguing, involving a man who had lived on the margins of the community. Someone remembered vaguely, more for his absence than his presence. He'd worked odd jobs, kept to himself, moved frequently, the kind of person who slips through cracks of collective memory until there's a reason to look closer. His name appeared in an old tip, dismissed for lack of evidence. But now, with fresh context, it carried new weight. Detectives tracked him across states, through employment records and arrest logs, piecing together a timeline that overlapped with the disappearance in ways that were difficult to ignore. They found him older, quieter, a life worn down by time, and when they knocked on his door, the past rushed in like cold air. The interview was tense, measured, each question carefully placed, each answer revealing just enough to be unsettling. He denied knowing the teen, denied being in the area, denied everything with a calm that felt rehearsed, and yet there were moments, brief and subtle, where his story bent under its own weight. No confession came, no dramatic collapse, just a lingering sense that something important had been brushed against without being grasped. Forensic testing continued in the background, slow and methodical, constrained by the reality that evidence degrades, memories fade, and the margin for error shrinks with every passing year. Partial DNA profiles sat in databases, waiting for a match that might never come, and genealogy leads branched outward into families who had nothing to do with the crime except for a shared strand of genetic code. Investigators debated ethics and strategy, aware that every move now carried legal and moral consequences amplified by time. The community's relationship with the case evolved again, reshaped by the digital age. Online forums dissected documents, podcasts dramatized theories, and the teen's disappearance became content, her story retold by voices far removed from the original pain. Some of it helped, generating tips and attention. Some of it harmed, spreading misinformation and suspicion. The family tried not to watch, knowing that every retelling risked distorting the person they remembered, turning a daughter, a friend, a student into a symbol stripped of nuance. As another anniversary approached, investigators faced a familiar crossroads, the question that haunts every long-running cold case: how much to reveal and when. A press update could reignite public interest, but it could also compromise fragile leads. Silence protected the investigation, but fueled speculation. They chose carefully, releasing just enough to signal movement without promising answers, and the response was immediate, hope flaring across the town, cautious but undeniable. Behind closed doors, doubts persisted. What if the truth was simpler than imagined, hidden not in elaborate conspiracies or serial patterns, but in a single impulsive act long buried by fear and chance? What if the person responsible had died or confessed to no one, leaving the case permanently suspended between what was known and what could never be proven? These questions lingered in the quiet hours, when investigators stared at photographs and wondered whether justice delayed was justice denied, or whether persistence itself was a form of justice. The cold case pressed on, defined now by endurance rather than urgency, by the refusal to let silence win completely. The family held on to that refusal, even when it hurt, even when it demanded energy they barely had left. They had learned that answers, if they came, would arrive without warning, without ceremony, and until then, the only certainty was uncertainty itself. Somewhere in the tangled web of evidence and memory, the truth remained, intact but inaccessible, and as the investigation crept forward, guided by patience and stubborn hope, the case continued to cast its long shadow, reminding everyone involved that unresolved stories don't fade. They wait. And waiting, in its own way, can be the most exhausting part of all. The waiting stretched thinner as the case crossed another invisible threshold, the point where time itself became an adversary, eroding not just evidence but the people chasing it. Investigators felt it in their bodies, the late nights harder to endure, the weight of the file heavier than its pages suggested. Because every cold case that survives this long begins to ask a dangerous question. What if the truth is already gone? But this one refused to settle, refused to accept its place in storage, and instead, it began to push back quietly through fragments that didn't quite fit together until someone finally slowed down enough to notice. A re-examination of phone records, once dismissed as too limited to matter, revealed small anomalies, calls placed and received within narrow windows of time, numbers that seemed insignificant before digital mapping made proximity easier to visualize. One call, brief and unanswered, originated near the route investigators now believed she may have taken that morning. And while it didn't name a suspect, it anchored the timeline in a way nothing else had. The past snapped into slightly sharper focus, and with it came the realization that the disappearance may have unfolded faster than anyone had assumed. Minutes, not hours, the kind of speed that leaves no room for witnesses to process what they're seeing. This shifted the narrative again, reframing the crime not as something planned over time, but as an opportunistic act, sudden, violent, and devastatingly efficient. Detectives revisited the theory with unease. Because crimes of opportunity are the hardest to solve, their randomness defying patterns and profiles. They traced potential paths from her home to the last known point, calculating sight lines, traffic flow, blind spots, and the picture that emerged was disturbingly ordinary. Any number of people could have been there. Any number of cars could have stopped without drawing attention. The safety the town had once taken for granted was revealed as an illusion built on habit, not reality. The industrial area came back into focus, no longer just as a place where belongings were found, but as a transitional zone, a liminal space where people disappear between destinations. Workers who had been there at the time were tracked down years later, some cooperative, others defensive, a few genuinely unable to remember details that once seemed trivial. One man recalled a vehicle parked at an odd angle. Another remembered a young woman walking quickly, head down, as if trying not to be noticed, but memory is a fragile thing, especially when shaped by decades of retelling, and investigators treated these recollections like glass, careful not to shatter them with expectation. The family was informed cautiously of these developments, and their response was muted, a mix of gratitude and restraint born from experience. They had learned not to celebrate momentum, not to mistake movement for progress. But even so, the renewed focus stirred something they kept buried, a fragile hope that answers might arrive within their lifetime. They spoke less publicly now, choosing privacy over press conferences, because grief had taught them that exposure didn't equal resolution, and sometimes silence was the only way to protect what little remained intact. Behind the scenes, legal considerations loomed larger, shaping every decision. Without a body, without a definitive crime scene, prosecutors advised caution, reminding investigators that suspicion alone could not survive a courtroom. Every piece of evidence had to stand on its own, untainted by time or interpretation, and that standard narrowed the field dramatically. Leads that felt promising in theory dissolved under scrutiny, and the gap between what seemed likely and what could be proven stretched wider with every year that passed. Still, the case pressed forward, fueled by small victories that outsiders never saw, a corrected date here, a clarified statement there, incremental progress that felt invisible until stacked together. Investigators debated strategy late into the night, weighing the merits of confrontation versus surveillance, of public appeals versus quiet persistence, aware that the wrong move could send the truth retreating for good. Cold cases don't forgive recklessness. They punish it. Then came another development, subtle but seismic, when a long dormant tip resurfaced, not because it was new, but because someone finally took the time to read it without the context of old assumptions. It described a brief interaction, a teenager approached by a stranger offering help, directions, a ride, nothing overtly threatening, nothing that would have triggered alarm in a different time, in a safer-feeling place. The description of the stranger was vague, but the behavior aligned disturbingly well with the emerging theory of an opportunistic crime, and for the first time, investigators felt the pieces nudging closer together. They traced the origin of the tip, found the witness older and reluctant, burdened by guilt for not speaking up sooner, and the interview unfolded slowly, haltingly, memory and emotion tangled together. The witness couldn't be certain it was her, couldn't swear to details, but the timing was right, the location plausible, and the interaction haunting in its simplicity. Sometimes the most chilling moments in cold cases aren't violent acts, but ordinary encounters that only reveal their significance in hindsight. The town barely noticed these shifts, life moving on in predictable rhythms. But beneath the surface, the case had entered a new phase, one defined less by searching and more by narrowing, by the uncomfortable realization that the truth might not be extraordinary at all. It might be banal, the product of a single decision made in seconds, a decision that rippled outward for decades, reshaping lives in ways the person responsible may never fully comprehend. As the investigation edged closer to something solid, investigators felt a familiar tension tighten, the sense that the story was approaching a bend where it would either open into clarity or collapse back into ambiguity. They knew better than to assume which direction it would take, because cold cases thrive on false dawns, on the illusion of resolution just out of reach. And so the waiting continued, heavier now, charged with possibility, as the past pressed against the present with increasing insistence, reminding everyone involved that unanswered questions don't disappear. They accumulate, and when they finally demand attention, they do so with a force that can no longer be ignored. The pressure finally began to show cracks, not in the evidence, but in the people orbiting the case, because time has a way of loosening tongues even when it hardens facts. Investigators noticed at first in interviews the slight shifts in posture, the hesitation before answers that used to come too quickly, the kind of discomfort that doesn't announce guilt but suggests unfinished business. One former witness asked to speak again, unprompted, a rare and telling move in a case this old. And when they sat down, the room felt smaller, the air heavier, as if the past had followed them inside. The witness talked about fear, about being young at the time, about not wanting to get involved. And as the words spilled out, so did a detail that had never been documented properly, a second person present during that brief, unsettling interaction years ago. A bystander, a driver, someone close enough to matter. The description was still hazy, still compromised by memory, but it added a new dimension to the narrative, complicating it in ways that felt uncomfortably real. Crimes are rarely clean. They bleed into the lives of people who never intended to be part of them. Investigators moved carefully, verify what they could, cross-referencing names, locations, routines, building a shadow timeline that ran parallel to the official one. They identified individuals who had been in proximity not just geographically, but socially, overlapping circles that hadn't seemed relevant before. One name surfaced repeatedly, never at the center, always at the edge, a person who appeared in unrelated records, traffic stops, minor complaints, nothing criminal enough to stand out, but persistent enough to raise eyebrows when viewed collectively. Surveillance followed, discreet and legally constrained, a delicate dance between patience and urgency. The subject lived a quiet life now, routine-bound, predictable, the kind of normalcy that could be either reassuring or deeply unsettling depending on context. Investigators watched, listened, waited for someone to slip, knowing that after decades, the smallest inconsistency could be more revealing than any dramatic confession. But days passed without incident. Weeks stretched on and the silence tested their resolve. Behind closed doors, strategy sessions grew more intense. Should they confront? Should they wait? Cold cases punish impatience, but they also reward timing, and the line between the two is razor thin. Prosecutors weighed in again, cautious to the point of frustration, reminding everyone that suspicion is not proof, that juries demand narratives that make sense without leaning on emotion or hindsight. The case had to be built like architecture, each support tested, each angle justified, because if it collapsed in court, it might never be rebuilt. The family was kept informed in broad strokes, shielded from details that could raise false expectations. But even those careful updates carried weight. They listened without interrupting, their reactions measured, eyes betraying what words refused to show. They had lived with uncertainty long enough to know that clarity, if it came, would not arrive gently. It would tear through decades of coping mechanisms, rewriting grief in ways they could not yet imagine. Public interest stirred again. Fueled by leaks and speculation, the phrase cold case nearing breakthrough appearing in headlines that offered more promise than substance. The family avoided the noise, choosing to focus inward, because hope amplified by strangers had hurt them before. Investigators, meanwhile, tightened their circle, aware that too much exposure could compromise everything. The truth, if it was going to surface, needed space. Then came a moment that shifted the internal temperature of the case. Not a breakthrough, but realization when analysts revisited old crime statistics and noticed a subtle correlation, a spike in reports that coincided with the year of the disappearance. Incidents dismissed individually, but alarming when viewed together. Attempted abductions, suspicious approaches, near misses that never escalated into crimes, or at least never got reported as such. The pattern didn't prove anything, but it reframed the context, suggesting that the town's sense of safety at the time may have been dangerously misplaced. This reframing fed back into the suspect pool, narrowing it further, aligning behavioral clues with opportunity and access. Investigators felt the walls closing in, not on a person yet, but on a version of events that finally made sense, a narrative that didn't rely on coincidence or extraordinary planning. It was ordinary. That was the most disturbing part. Ordinary people, ordinary days, ordinary decisions, intersecting in a moment that shattered a life and rippled outward forever. Still, the central question remained unanswered, the one that haunted every meeting, every late-night drive home. Where was she? Without that answer, the case hovered in limbo, emotionally charged but legally fragile. Search efforts were discussed again, targeted this time, informed by updated theories rather than desperation, but the landscape had changed, developed, reshaped by years of progress that buried whatever secrets it once held. As investigators pushed forward, they felt the weight of expectation pressing in from all sides, the community's hunger for resolution, the family's need for truth, their own professional pride bound tightly to an outcome that remained stubbornly uncertain. Cold cases have a way of personalizing failure, turning unanswered questions into quiet accusations, and this one was no different. Yet something had shifted, undeniable and irreversible. The case was no longer drifting. It was moving slowly, deliberately, pulled forward by forces that had been building for years beneath the surface. The past was no longer a distant echo. It was close enough to touch, close enough to feel its breath. And as investigators prepared for the next step, whatever it might be, they understood that the story was entering a phase where there would be consequences, where silence would become harder to maintain, and where the truth, once revealed, would not just answer questions, but change the shape of everything that came after. The first real fracture came quietly, without sirens or headlines, in the form of a document that should have been routine, a property transfer buried in county records, the kind of paperwork no one notices until it suddenly matters. An analyst flagged it late one night, a land sale that coincided almost perfectly with the months following the disappearance, involving a remote parcel miles from where her belongings had been found, a place that hadn't been searched because no one knew to look there. The timing felt wrong in the way coincidences sometimes do, not impossible, just unsettling enough to demand attention. Investigators drove out to see it themselves, the road narrowing as the city fell away, pavement giving way to dirt, the landscape opening into stretches of scrub and uneven ground that swallowed sound. This was the kind of place people forgot existed, a place that had changed hands quietly and been left largely untouched, and as they stood there, staring at land that had absorbed decades of weather and silence, the question took on a new weight. If something had been hidden here, time might not have erased it completely. Time, after all, is thorough but not perfect. Search warrants followed, cautious and precise, because after this long, Every move had to be defensible. Ground-penetrating radar swept the area. Grids were marked, soil samples taken, and the process was painstakingly slow, each pass revealing shapes and anomalies that might be natural or might be something else entirely. Investigators kept their expectations in check, but tension hummed just beneath the surface. The awareness that this could either be another false lead or the moment everything shifted. The family was notified before the search began, not with promises, not with optimism, just with honesty, and the news landed heavily, reopening a door they'd learned to keep closed. They waited at home, surrounded by decades of absence, imagining possibilities they tried not to imagine before, because this was different from rumors or theories. This was physical. This was real ground, real effort, real risk of answers they might not be ready to receive. Days passed with no definitive findings, and the silence grew oppressive, the kind that amplifies every footstep, every radio call, every glance between investigators. Then, late in the afternoon on the fourth day, something changed. Equipment readings clustered in one area, irregularities stacking up just enough to warrant excavation. The work slowed further, shovels replaced by smaller tools, movements deliberate, respectful, and as the earth was peeled back inch by inch, the weight of the moment pressed down on everyone present. What they found wasn't immediate clarity, not a single unmistakable truth, but fragments, disturbed soil, remnants that suggested human activity where none should have been. No announcement was made, no conclusions drawn. The site was secured, samples cataloged, and the process shifted from searching to preserving. In cold cases, discovery is rarely cinematic. It's procedural, careful, almost understated, because the cost of being wrong is too high. Back at the station, the mood changed, a low, focused intensity, replacing years of frustration. Forensic teams went to work, analyzing what little the site had yielded, aware that even the smallest detail could tip the balance. Results wouldn't come quickly, and everyone knew it. Science has its own pace, indifferent to grief and anticipation, and the weight resumed, heavier now, loaded with stakes that felt almost unbearable. Meanwhile, attention turned back to the human element, to the individuals whose lives intersected with that land, that time, that window of opportunity. Records were pulled again, interviews recontextualized, and the man who had hovered on the edge of the investigation for years moved closer to the center, not because of a single damning fact, but because everything else had slowly fallen away. His connection to property was indirect but traceable, a chain of associations that felt increasingly difficult to dismiss as coincidence. When investigators sat down with him again, the dynamic was different. The questions were sharper, the pauses longer, and the room felt charged with unspoken knowledge. He noticed it too. His answers came slower now, his certainty fraying at the edges, small contradictions slipping through despite careful wording. No confession emerged, but something else did, a defensive urgency, a sense that the past was no longer safely buried. For seasoned detectives, that shift spoke volumes. Outside the interview room, prosecutors watched closely, recalculating, aware that the case was approaching a point of no return. They discussed thresholds, what would be enough to move forward, what risks remained, because once a suspect is publicly named in a case this old, there is no going back. The margin for error had vanished years ago. The community sensed it, too, even without details, a collective awareness that the long-dormant story was stirring again. Conversations grew hushed speculative, tinged with dread, because resolution, when it comes, is rarely clean. It forces people to reevaluate memories, relationships, assumptions they'd carried for decades. A cold case solved doesn't just answer questions. It creates new ones. As the forensic clock ticked on, investigators found themselves confronting an unexpected emotion, not triumph, but apprehension. After so many years of uncertainty, the idea of knowing felt almost as heavy as not knowing at all. Answers would bring accountability, yes, but they would also lock the story into a shape that could never be changed, stripping away the fragile hope that things might somehow be less terrible than imagined. And so the case hovered at the edge of transformation, balanced between mystery and revelation, the past pressing hard against the present. Whatever the results would show, whatever conclusions would follow, one truth had become unavoidable. The disappearance that had haunted a town for decades was no longer just a cold case file gathering dust. It was active, alive, and moving toward an ending that would ripple far beyond the moment it finally arrived. The results arrived without ceremony, delivered in sealed envelopes in cautious language, the kind designed to temper expectation even as it acknowledges significance. Forensic analysis confirmed human remains, partial and degraded, but unmistakably real, and with that confirmation the case crossed a line it could never retreat from. The search site was no longer a theory or a possibility. It was now a place of consequence, a silent witness pulled back into the present after decades of concealment. Investigators felt the shift immediately, the air in the room heavier, the stakes sharper, because discovery, once made, demands answers. Identification would take time. The remains had endured years of weather and neglect, and science could only move so fast, but early indicators aligned with what investigators feared and expected in equal measure: age range, time frame, context. Nothing conclusive yet, but enough to reshape every conversation that followed. The family was informed again, this time with more gravity, and the news landed differently than all the others before it. Not as speculation, not as hope or rumor, but as something solid and irreversible. They listened quietly, asked careful questions, and when the call ended, they sat with the weight of the loan, knowing that whatever came next would change them forever. As forensic work continued, attention narrowed decisively onto the man who had lingered at the edge of the case for so long. Investigators retraced his movements with renewed urgency, aligning timelines with land records, employment logs, and personal history, and the overlaps grew harder to ignore. He had access, he had opportunity, and now, circumstantially at least, he had proximity to a place where the truth had been buried. Still, circumstantial evidence is a fragile thing, especially after decades, and detectives knew better than to confuse momentum with certainty. They brought him in again, this time with a different posture, not accusatory, not confrontational, but firm, the kind of presence that signals a narrowing path. He sensed it immediately. The casual defenses fell away, replaced by guarded silence, his answers shorter, his eyes scanning the room as if searching for an exit that didn't exist. Investigators laid out facts slowly, methodically, watching for reactions, noting the moments where his composure slipped, where a flicker of recognition crossed his face before being buried again. No confession came, but the distance between denial and truth felt thinner than ever. Prosecutors wrestled with the case late into the night, parsing evidence and risk, weighing the need for justice against the possibility of failure. They knew the family had waited long enough. That delay itself could be a kind of cruelty, but they also knew that moving too soon could jeopardize everything. The remains offered potential closure, but without definitive identification and a clear narrative, the case still rested on a knife's edge. Cold cases demand precision, and precision takes time. Public pressure surged again, fed by leaks and whispers that something significant had been found. The media circled, careful but eager, reviving old footage, replaying images of the teen frozen in time, her smile now framed by words like breakthrough and long-awaited answers. The family withdrew further, shielding themselves from the noise, because they understood better than anyone how easily hope could turn into another wound. Behind the scenes, forensic genealogy re-entered the picture, this time with greater urgency. DNA extracted from the remains, however limited, was compared again, databases scoured with renewed focus, and when potential familial connections surfaced, it sent a quiet shock through the investigation. The line was tenuous, distant, but real enough to pursue, and it pointed back toward the same orbit investigators had been circling for years. The past was beginning to fold in on itself. Search efforts expanded around the original site, targeted and deliberate, uncovering additional signs of disturbance that suggested a hurried attempt to conceal rather than an expertly planned crime. This detail mattered. It supported the theory of an impulsive act followed by panic, a narrative that fit the evolving picture with unsettling ease. The monster the town had imagined for years shrank into something more ordinary and, because of that, more frightening. As evidence accumulated, investigators felt a strange reversal, the sense that the case was no longer chasing the truth, but being pulled toward it momentum driven by inevitability rather than effort. The question was no longer something would happen, but how and at what cost? Every step forward carried the weight of decades of silence and the responsibility to get it right pressed down harder with each passing day. For the family, the world narrowed to waiting again, but this waiting felt different, less abstract, more final. They began to prepare for outcomes they'd never allowed themselves to imagine fully, for answers that might satisfy curiosity but never heal loss. Closure, they knew, was a word people used when they hadn't lived inside a cold case, a concept that promised too much and delivered too little. As the investigation approached its most critical phase, the community held its breath once more, aware that whatever truth emerged would not just belong to the past. It would reshape the present, force reckonings, challenge assumptions, and leave marks that couldn't be undone. The cold case, long defined by absence, was filling in its blanks, one by one, and with each revelation, the silence that had protected secrets for decades grew thinner, more fragile, as if the truth itself was preparing to speak. The confirmation came in fragments first, never all at once, because the truth rarely arrives cleanly after so many years of decay. Forensic specialists spoke in probabilities and margins, careful language built to withstand scrutiny, but beneath the caution was a current of certainty that investigators felt immediately. The remains were consistent, the timeline aligned. The genetic markers, incomplete but persuasive, pointed toward the same family line they had been circling for years, and with that, the question that had haunted the case began to collapse inward, no longer asking what might have happened, but how it had been allowed to stay hidden for so long. When the final report reached the task force, the room went quiet, not with relief, not with celebration, but with gravity. This was the moment they had chased across decades, and it felt heavier than imagined. The remains were identified, not through a single definitive test, but through accumulation, bone analysis, DNA comparison, contextual evidence converging until denial became impossible. She had been found, not whole, not preserved, but undeniably there. The missing teen was missing no longer, and that truth rewrote everything that came before it. The family was told in person. No phones, no intermediaries, just words spoken carefully, deliberately, in a room chosen for privacy, but incapable of containing the weight of what followed. Grief surged back, sharp and fresh, collapsing years of coping into a single moment, because knowing is not the same as healing. Knowing only sharpens the edges of loss. They listened, asked questions they had rehearsed for years, and when it was over, they walked out carrying answers that felt heavier than uncertainty ever had. With identification came momentum that could no longer be restrained. Investigators moved quickly now, aware that delay would only invite doubt. Warrants were executed, digital records seized. Old storage units were reopened, forgotten possessions cataloged, and within that quiet inventory, something shifted. A personal item surfaced, unremarkable to anyone else, devastating in context, and its presence in the suspect's possession collapsed years of plausible deniability in an instant. The past had finally left fingerprints. The suspect was brought in again, this time without ambiguity. The interview room felt smaller than ever, the walls pressing inward as evidence was laid out piece by piece. Not dramatically, not aggressively, but with precision. Dates, locations, physical proof. The rhythm of denial faltered. Silence stretched. His breathing changed. And then came the moment investigators had learned never to expect, but always to prepare for, not a confession, but a correction, a single sentence adjusting a detail. He could not have known unless he had been there. That was enough. The arrest was quiet. No spectacle. No flashing cameras at first. Just handcuffs clicking shut after decades of absence. The sound almost anticlimactic in its simplicity. The suspect did not resist. He did not speak. He looked older than his years, worn down by time and whatever secrets had kept him awake at night. As he was led away, investigators felt no triumph, only a deep, unsettling calm, the kind that follows the end of a long chase when adrenaline has nowhere left to go. The news broke within hours. Headlines exploded. Cold case solved. Missing teen found after decades. Arrest shocked community. The town reeled, recognition rippling outward as people connected names to faces, memories to headlines. Some felt vindicated. Others felt betrayed. Many felt both. This was not a stranger from outside, not a shadowy figure passing through. This was someone who had existed among them, unnoticed, unchallenged, ordinary. The family issued a statement, brief and restrained, asking for privacy, acknowledging gratitude, offering no forgiveness, no commentary beyond the truth that mattered most to them. She had been found. She had not been forgotten. Everything else felt secondary. Justice, they knew, would now move at its own pace, slow and procedural, bound by rules that could not restore what was taken. Prosecutors began building the case publicly, outlining a narrative that mirrored what investigators had long suspected, an encounter that escalated quickly, panic replacing intention, concealment replacing accountability. It was not a story of grand evil, but a catastrophic choice, and that made it harder for the community to process. Monsters are easier to understand than mirrors. As court dates were set and evidence prepared, the town entered a new phase of reckoning, one defined not by mystery, but by consequence. Conversations changed. Silence shifted. People replayed interactions, searching for signs they might have missed, moments that now felt charged with meaning. The cold case that had once united them in shared uncertainty now divided them in shared disbelief. And through it all, the weight of finality settled in. The questions that had once driven the search were answered, but new ones emerged in their place. Quieter, more personal, and far harder to resolve. How does a community forgive itself for not seeing? How does a family rebuild a future shaped by absence and truth? How does justice account for time stolen and never returned? The case moved forward, no longer cold, no longer unsolved, but the echoes remained, because even when a story reaches its conclusion, the impact doesn't fade on cue. It lingers, reshaping lives in subtle, permanent ways, reminding everyone involved that answers, when they finally arrive, do not close wounds. They simply change the way they ache. The courtroom became the new center of gravity, a place where decades of silence were translated into language precise enough to survive challenge, and every word mattered more than ever. The suspect, now a defendant, sat still beneath fluorescent lights, stripped of anonymity, his name repeated in open session until it felt strange that it had ever gone unnoticed. Prosecutors spoke carefully, aware that time had turned this case into something fragile, and they built their narrative brick by brick, not for spectacle, but for permanence, because this was not just about proving what happened. It was about proving that what happened still mattered. Evidence moved from boxes to tables, from theory to exhibit, each item carrying a weight disproportionate to its size. Maps marked with dates. Photos taken years apart that now aligned with unsettling clarity. Expert testimony translated fragments of bone and partial DNA into meaning jurors could understand without exaggeration. Defense attorneys pushed back, as expected, leaning into uncertainty, into the erosion of memory, into the idea that time itself was the true suspect here, capable of distorting even the most sincere conclusions. The tension was constant, a low hum that never faded, because everyone in the room understood what was at stake. The family sat together, not looking at the defendant, not looking at the jury, eyes fixed somewhere beyond the room, carrying themselves with restraint that spoke louder than any outburst could have. This was not the closure people imagine when they talk about solved cold cases. There was no release, no sense of balance restored, just endurance, the discipline of showing up day after day to hear the worst moments of a life dissected by strangers. Every detail reopened wounds, but walking away felt impossible, because absence had already taken enough. Witnesses testified about things they wished they could forget, about moments they hadn't understood at the time, about decisions made under fear or confusion that now felt unbearable. Some voices shook. Others stayed flat, professional, detached. Investigators described the long arc of the case, the missteps, the breakthroughs, the patience required to outlast denial, and as they spoke, the scale of what it had taken to reach this room became clear. This was not a single investigation. It was a relay run across generations, each handoff imperfect, each delay costly. Outside the courthouse, the town grappled with its own reckoning. Conversations grew quieter, more careful. People avoided the places associated with the case, not out of superstition, but out of fatigue, because the story had followed them for too long to be processed all at once. Some expressed anger at law enforcement for taking so long. Others expressed gratitude that they hadn't given up. Many felt both, because cold cases don't resolve cleanly. They expose every flaw along the way. Media coverage intensified, dissecting testimony, speculating about outcomes, reducing decades of pain into segments and sound bites. And the family learned again how public resolution can feel just as invasive as public mystery. They declined interviews. They let the facts speak, because facts were all that remained uncontested. Justice, they understood, was no longer something they controlled. It was a process unfolding in real time, bound by rules that could never fully account for loss. As the trial progressed, a strange shift occurred, subtle but unmistakable. The case stopped being about discovery and became about acknowledgement. The community heard, officially, what had happened. The story that had lived in fragments was now laid out in sequence, stripped of speculation, anchored by evidence. It was not comforting. It was not cinematic. It was ordinary in the most devastating way, a sequence of small decisions cascading into irreversible harm, and that ordinariness unsettled people more than any imagined horror ever had. The defense rested. The prosecution rested. Closing arguments echoed through the room, not dramatic, not loud, but deliberate, each side appealing to reason, to doubt, to responsibility. The jury was sent away, and with them went the last illusion of control. Waiting returned, familiar and cruel, but this time it carried a finality the family had never known before. This waiting would end one way or another. There would be no reopening, no revisiting, no second-guessing the outcome once it arrived. When the verdict came, it did not land with a bang. It landed like a weight. The words were spoken. The meanings settled. Accountability, partial and imperfect, had finally arrived. There were no cheers, no gasps, just a collective exhale from a room that had been holding its breath for decades. Justice, delayed and diminished by time, had still found a way to speak. Sentencing followed weeks later, measured and restrained, acknowledging both the severity of the crime and the reality that no punishment could restore what had been taken. The defendant listened, expression unreadable, as years were assigned to actions that had taken seconds, and the imbalance had all hung heavy in the air. Time, once again, was the central character, stealing youth, stretching grief, compressing accountability into a fraction of its impact. When it was over, when the gavel fell and the room emptied, the family stepped outside into daylight that felt unfamiliar, as if the world had shifted slightly while they weren't looking. They had answers now. They had a name. They had a place to direct grief that had once been shapeless. But they also carried the knowledge that resolution does not erase absence, and truth does not undo time. The cold case had been solved, officially, irrevocably, but its shadow lingered, because some stories don't end when the system says they do. They end slowly, unevenly, in the quiet moments afterward, when people learn how to live in a world where question mark has finally been replaced with period, and they must decide what comes next. The town did not celebrate when it was over. There were no banners, no sense of victory, only a strange quiet that settled in after years of noise, as if everyone was relearning how to exist without the constant hum of uncertainty in the background. The headlines faded quickly, replaced by newer stories, but the weight of what had been uncovered lingered in ways that didn't make the news, in empty chairs at dinner tables, in streets that suddenly felt altered by knowledge alone. For the family, life after answers proved harder to define than life without them. For decades, grief had been suspended in motion, driven by questions, by the possibility that something might change tomorrow. Now tomorrow arrived without mystery, and the finality of it was disorienting. They visited the site where she was found, not for closure, not for peace, but because it mattered to acknowledge the place where her story had been hidden for so long. The land was quiet, indifferent, unchanged, and standing there made one truth painfully clear. The world does not pause for tragedy. It absorbs it and moves on. They began the slow work of reshaping memory, of allowing her to exist as more than a case number, more than a headline, more than a symbol of loss. Stories resurfaced, ordinary ones, laughter, arguments, plans that never had the chance to fail or succeed. This, they realized, was a real aftermath of a cold case solved, not the arrest or the verdict, but the reclaiming of a life from the machinery that had reduced it to evidence. The community wrestled with its own reckoning. People replayed years in their minds, conversations, encounters, moments that now felt charged with meaning. Trust, once broken by uncertainty, was tested again by proximity, by the realization that the truth had lived among them unnoticed. Some relationships strained under that weight. Others deepened, bonded by shared disbelief and shared responsibility to remember. Law enforcement moved on to other cases, other files waiting on shelves. But this one stayed with them, a reminder etched into professional memory. It became a lesson cited quietly, about patience, about humility, about the cost of early assumptions and the power of persistence. Cold cases, they knew now more than ever, are not just about what was missed, but about what was refused to be abandoned. In the months that followed, small changes appeared, subtle but meaningful. A scholarship in her name, a bench placed at the school she never finished, acts of remembrance that resisted spectacle, choosing permanence over attention. These gestures did not fix anything. They were not meant to. They existed simply to say that her absence had been noticed, that her life had weight beyond the circumstances of its end. And still, the echoes remained. The sound of that early morning phone call never fully left the house it rang through. The image of a teenager stepping out into an ordinary day lingered in the collective imagination, a reminder of how thin the line is between routine and catastrophe. Even with answers, the story continued to haunt, because understanding how something happened does not explain why it was allowed to steal so much. Cold cases promise resolution, but what they deliver is truth, and truth is heavier than mystery. It demands acceptance, not relief. It asks people to live with knowledge instead of hope, and that transition is rarely gentle. For this family, for this town, the end of the case marked the beginning of something quieter and harder, the work of carrying truth without letting it define every breath. Years from now, new residents would move in, unaware of the history beneath their feet. Children would grow up playing on streets that once held secrets. The world would continue its forward motion, as it always does. But the story would remain, archived not just in records and transcripts, but in the shared understanding that some answers come too late to heal, yet still matter because they affirm that disappearance is not the same as erasure. The cold case had been solved, the file closed, the system satisfied, but its legacy endured in a more human way, in vigilance, in memory, in the quiet resolve to look closer, to ask harder questions, to refuse easy assumptions. Because the true ending of a story like this is not found in a verdict or a sentence, but in a collective decision to remember, to learn, and to carry forward the knowledge that even the longest silence can be broken, and when it is the truth, however painful, deserves to be heard. Time kept moving, indifferent to the weight the case had carried, and in that movement something unexpected happened. The story began to thin, not in importance, but in sharpness, its edges slowly smoothing as it settled into history. The file was archived, boxed, labeled, placed among thousands of others, but this one never truly blended in. Because every solved cold case leaves behind a residue, a quiet reminder that resolution does not equal restoration. Investigators returned to routine work. But occasionally, late at night, they would catch themselves staring at new evidence through the lens of that old case, more cautious now, more aware of how easily certainty can mislead. The family learned how to exist in a world where her name no longer triggered immediate urgency from strangers, where people spoke of the case in the past tense, as something completed. They corrected no one. Completion, they knew, was a word that belonged to paperwork, not a loss. What they carried forward was subtler, a sharpened awareness of time, of how quickly ordinary moments vanish, of how silence can stretch across decades if no one insists on listening closely enough. The town absorbed the lessons slowly. Safety meetings came and went. Policies shifted. Neighborhoods changed. But beneath all of it ran a quiet undercurrent of vigilance, a collective memory that resisted fading entirely. Parents paused a second longer at doorways. Teachers paid closer attention to small changes in behavior. not out of fear, but out of understanding, because tragedy had taught them that danger does not always announce itself. Occasionally, someone new would stumble across a story, a podcast listener, a late-night reader scrolling through old headlines, and the case would briefly resurface online, framed as proof that persistence pays off, that justice, even delayed, is still justice. Those retellings were never wrong, exactly, but they were incomplete. They could not convey the years lived inside the question mark, the way uncertainty reshapes identity, the exhaustion of hope that refuses to die. That part of the story remained unspoken, carried only by those who had lived it. The place where she disappeared changed the most quietly. The street was repaved. The corner looked cleaner, brighter, stripped of the visual memory that had once anchored the mystery. People passed through without noticing anything unusual, and that ordinariness felt almost surreal, because this was where everything had fractured, where one ordinary morning had split into two timelines, before and after. The absence of markers felt intentional, as if the world itself preferred not to linger. And yet, absence has a gravity of its own. It pulls memory back, again and again, to moments that refuse to fade completely. The case became a reference point, cited in training sessions, whispered in conversations about other disappearances, a reminder that patience is not passive, that waiting, when paired with persistence, can still lead somewhere. It changed how people thought about time, about guilt, about the idea that secrets can outlast those who keep them. The final truth of the case is settled into something simple and devastating. What happened was not extraordinary in its execution. It was not inevitable. It was a collision of opportunity and choice, of inattention and fear, and the damage it caused rippled outward far beyond the moment itself. That understanding lingered longer than any headline ever could. In the end, the story did not conclude with certainty or peace. It ended with awareness. Awareness that cold cases are not frozen moments, but living questions that age alongside the people they affect. Awareness that answers, when they arrive, do not repair what was broken, but they do honor the truth that something mattered enough to be pursued to the very end. And somewhere in the quiet space between memory and history, the case continued to exist no longer as a mystery, not just as a solved file, but as a reminder etched into collective consciousness that silence can last for decades, but it is never guaranteed to win, and that even after the longest night, the truth has a way of surfacing, not to comfort, not to heal, but to be known. Even after everything had been said, written, archived, there were moments when the case seemed to breathe again, not loudly, not urgently, but in the quiet spaces where memory refuses to stay contained. A detective would pause at a stoplight near the old route, momentarily disoriented by the sense that something unfinished still lingered there. A former classmate would hear her name unexpectedly, spoken by someone too young to have known the story firsthand, and feel the strange weight of realizing how far the ripples had traveled. This was the afterlife of a cold case, not resolution, but resonance. The family discovered that grief does not recede in a straight line once answers arrive. Some days felt lighter, as if certainty had removed a layer of pressure they carried unconsciously for years. Other days felt heavier, because knowing replaced imagining, and imagination, for all its cruelty, had at least allowed room for possibility. Now there was a fixed truth, immovable and sharp, and learning how to live beside it required a different kind of strength, quieter and more patient than anything they'd needed before. They spoke her name more freely now, no longer afraid that doing so would reopen a wound that had never truly closed. In telling stories, they reclaimed pieces of her that had been overshadowed by the crime, her stubbornness, her humor, the plans she talked about with the careless confidence of youth. These details mattered more than ever, because they pushed back against the gravity of the ending, insisting that a life cannot be reduced to how it ended without doing violence to everything that came before. In professional circles, the case took on a different kind of life. It was referenced in seminars, discussed in hushed tones as an example of both failure and persistence, a reminder that early assumptions can calcify into blind spots, and that patience, when paired with evolving technology, can resurrect truths long buried. It changed how some investigators approached new cases, instilling a caution that bordered on reverence for the unknown, and understanding that certainty is seductive but often premature. The community's relationship with the story softened over time, the initial shock giving way to something more reflective. The case became part of local history, mentioned without whispers, taught indirectly through changes in policy and awareness rather than through fear. The lesson endured not as paranoia, but as attentiveness, a collective decision to notice more, to listen longer, to question the comfortable narratives that make danger easier to ignore. What remained most striking was how ordinary everything looked once the dust settled. The streets were still streets. The morning still arrived on schedule. Life continued with its relentless normalcy, and that normalcy was perhaps the most unsettling legacy of all. It underscored how easily tragedy can coexist with routine, how thin the barriers between the expected and the unthinkable, and how rarely the world signals which side of that barrier we're about to cross. The cold case, once a living question, became a fixed point in time, but its influence stretched forward, shaping decisions and perceptions in ways that were difficult to measure. It reminded those who knew it well that justice is not a moment, but a process, and that even when the process concludes, its consequences keep unfolding, quietly altering the landscape of memory and trust. In the end, the story did not demand to be revisited, but it never fully released its hold either. It existed now as a caution, a testament, a quiet insistence that truth, however delayed, carries its own gravity. And for those who had waited through decades of silence, that gravity was not a burden, but a proof that persistence can outlast secrecy, that absence does not equal forgetting, and that even the longest cold cases leave behind something warmer than mystery alone. The undeniable mark of a life that mattered enough to be searched for until the very end. Years later, when the case was mentioned at all, it was often reduced to a sentence, a solved cold case from California, a missing teen finally accounted for, answers delivered after decades of silence. The compression felt inevitable. Time flattens even the heaviest stories, sanding them down until they fit neatly into conversation. But for those who live inside it, the story never shrank. It remained expansive, layered, filled with moments that never made it into reports or documentaries, moments where the weight of uncertainty pressed hardest, where hope and despair were indistinguishable. The family learned that grief evolves rather than ends. It learned new rhythms, quieter ones, less visible to outsiders. Anniversaries no longer arrived with frantic anticipation or media attention, but they still arrived, carrying a subtle heaviness that settled into the day without announcing itself. They marked those days privately now, with gestures that felt more honest than public remembrance, a shared meal, a walk, a silence that needed no explanation. This was how they carried her forward, not as a case, not as a lesson, but as a presence woven into the fabric of their lives. Occasionally, someone would reach out, a stranger writing to say they had followed the story, that it had changed how they thought about safety, about time, about attention. These messages were read carefully, appreciated quietly, because they confirmed something the family had come to believe, that even in loss, impact can exist without spectacle. The story had reached beyond the town, beyond the state, not as entertainment, but as a reminder that persistence matters, that disappearance is not destiny. Within law enforcement, the case became a touchstone, not held up as a triumph, but as a responsibility. New investigators heard about it early in their careers, framed as a warning against complacency, against the comfort of early conclusions. It reinforced the idea that cold cases are not failures frozen in time, but opportunities deferred, waiting for someone patient enough, humble enough, to look again without ego. The case lived on in that mindset, shaping decisions long after the file itself was closed. The suspect, now a convict, faded from public interest quickly, his name losing its shock value as the news cycle moved on. This, too, felt appropriate. The story had never been about him, despite how much attention he demanded by his actions. Stripping him of notoriety was a small reclamation, a way of returning focus to the life that had been overshadowed for so long. In the quiet absence of attention, his role diminished, reduced to what it had always been, a single point of failure in a much larger human story. The town continued to change, as towns do. New families moved in, unaware of the history embedded in street corners and empty lots. Old businesses closed. New ones opened, Memory became selective, carried by those who had lived through it, and slowly transferred through tone rather than detail. People spoke about the case less, but when they did, it was with a gravity that suggested respect rather than fear. The story had matured, moving from shock to understanding. And still, in unexpected moments, the past surfaced. A familiar song, a photograph tucked into an old book, a passing reference that reopened a door thought long closed. These moments no longer overwhelmed. They reminded, they affirmed that healing does not mean forgetting, and that forgetting is not required for life to move forward. The balance was delicate, learned slowly, earned through endurance. What the case ultimately left behind was not closure, not in the way the word is often used, but clarity. Clarity about how fragile certainty is, about how long silence can last, about how much effort it takes to pull truth back into the light once it has been buried. That clarity reshaped priorities, sharpened attention, and instilled a quiet insistence on listening more carefully, especially when answers come slowly. The cold case had traveled a long arc, from sudden absence to unbearable waiting, from speculation to truth, from mystery to memory. It no longer demanded resolution. It existed now as a testament to time, to persistence, to the cost of looking away and the power of refusing to do so again. And somewhere in that long trajectory, beyond the evidence and the verdicts, beyond the headlines and the anniversaries, the simplest truth endured. A life had been lost. It had been searched for. It had been found. And in that finding, however late, something essential had been affirmed, that even when silence stretches across decades, it is not infinite, and that the truth once surfaced becomes part of the world forever, altering it in ways that cannot be undone. By the time the story reached its 15th turn, it no longer felt like a narrative with momentum, but like a current that had slowed enough to be felt beneath the surface of everyday life. The case no longer intruded. It lingered. It existed in the pauses between thoughts, in the way certain questions were asked more carefully, in the instinct to look twice when something didn't quite align. This was the final imprint of a cold case that had burned itself into bones of everyone it touched. For the family, there came a day when they realized they had stopped measuring time against the disappearance. Not consciously, not ceremonially, just a quiet shift, a morning that arrived without the familiar mental calculation of how many years it had been. The absence was still there, permanent and unmistakable, but it no longer dictated the shape of every thought. That realization brought no guilt, only a muted understanding that survival has its own rhythm, and that honoring the past does not require living inside it forever. They continue to speak of her in the present tense sometimes, not out of denial, but habit, because love does not always obey grammar. In those moments, she was not a victim or a headline or a solved cold case. She was a teenager again, late for school, impatient with small talk, certain the world would open for her on her own terms. That version of her remained untouched by evidence or verdicts, preserved in memory where no one could reduce her to conclusions. The community settled into a new normal, one shaped subtly by the knowledge it carried. People were less eager to dismiss the uncomfortable, less willing to assume that bad things belonged somewhere else. The case had taught them that danger doesn't announce itself as spectacle, that often arrives quietly, disguised as routine. This awareness did not harden the town. It sharpened it. It made attention a shared value, vigilance an unspoken agreement. In professional circles, the case continued to echo long after its legal end. It became shorthand for endurance, for the idea that unanswered questions are not failures, but responsibilities waiting to be reclaimed. Younger investigators listened differently when the story was told, not because it promised heroism, but because it exposed cost, the cost of delay, of assumption, of looking away when certainty feels easier than doubt. It reshaped how some approached their own cases, instilling a patience that bordered on reverence. The physical traces of the story faded fastest. Evidence rooms cleared. Courtrooms moved on. The land where the truth had been hidden returned to silence, unmarked and unremarkable to anyone who didn't know. This, too, felt inevitable. The world does not preserve pain on our behalf. It asks us to remember instead. And memory proved to be the final resting place of the case, not static, not fixed, but living, changing as those who carried it changed. Over time, the sharpest edges dulled, the anger softened. What remained was a sober understanding of how fragile certainty is, how easily lives can be diverted by moments that seem insignificant until they are not. The solved cold case no longer demanded attention, but still offered something to those who paused long enough to listen. It offered a reminder that persistence matters even when progress feels invisible. That truth can survive neglect. That silence, no matter how long it holds, is not absolute. It can be broken by patience, by humility, by the refusal to accept disappearance as an ending. In the end, the story did not conclude with triumph or relief. It concluded with recognition. Recognition that a life had been taken and then returned to the world through effort and insistence. Recognition that answers, however delayed, carry weight simply by existing. Recognition that the act of searching itself has value, even when the outcome cannot heal what was lost. The cold case had completed its long journey, from shock to mystery, from mystery to truth, from truth to memory. It no longer asked to be solved. It asked only to be remembered accurately, carefully, without spectacle. And in that remembering, something endured beyond evidence and timelines, a quiet affirmation that even in the longest silence, even across decades of